Hello everyone, and welcome to the 30% New York Initiative Documentation Updates recorded webinar. I'm Becky O'Connor, Farm to Institution Coordinator with Cornell Cooperative Extension's Harvest New York program. Harvest New York's goal is to expand and enhance Cornell Cooperative Extension's regional agriculture programs to spur agricultural economic development in New York State. Our local foods program increases investment and jobs in agriculture and food systems to enhance the viability of farms through expansion, value-added production, diversification, and distribution of locally produced fruits and vegetables. Together with Cheryl Thayer, Harvest New York's Agriculture and Economic Development Specialist, we have collectively supported statewide farm-to-school and farm-to-institution efforts for the past 7 years. We strive to strengthen New York's food and farming industry and to increase school and institutional knowledge of New York agriculture, food systems, and nutrition by providing boots-on-the-ground support to local supply chain partners and statewide support via resource development, training, and technical assistance. We believe investing in local agriculture is vital to creating healthy, sustainable food systems that provide New Yorkers with equitable food access and healthy diets. In this presentation, we will be reviewing updates and providing clarification on the documentation required for the 30% New York initiative. The information we will be covering is also included in the 30% New York Initiative Documentation Requirement Guide, which is linked to in the PDF version of this presentation. The guide and this presentation focus on the documentation required to accurately and sufficiently demonstrate a product qualifies as being a New York product per the New York State Department of Education's parameters. They were developed as general guidance designed to prepare school food authorities to be successful in their 30% New York Initiative audits. However, every scenario and food chain is different, which makes a one-size-fits-all approach challenging. An overall best practice is to obtain more documentation than you think you may need, as it is cumbersome and at times impossible to get the proper documentation several months after actual purchases were made. We will not be reviewing the actual application process as this has been thoroughly covered by State Ed. More information about the process can be found on the Child Nutrition website. We also won't be reviewing procurement or tracking as these topics have been covered in depth during other presentations. Procurement will be reviewed this summer during the 30% Initiative Conference. More details on this event will be released soon. Please note that while we consulted State Ed in the compilation of this guide and this presentation by, for example, having them review the guide and accompanying product formulation statements, school food authorities are ultimately responsible for ensuring that their individual tracking processes and documentation are accurate and sufficient. Before we begin with documentation requirements, let's quickly review tracking basics as related to documentation. First off, you want to retain clear documentation for all of your New York purchases. This includes invoices, packing slips, and product formulation statements. If you're pretty sure a product purchase qualifies, but you're still working on gathering the documentation you need, just retain or take a picture of the case label and keep it with your records. Next is invoices. Invoices must clearly state that products are New York. The words homegrown and local are not acceptable alternatives to New York, as these terms could have a variety of meanings. It also isn't acceptable to have a separate purchasing account with your distributor that you only use for New York products. What is acceptable is for an invoice to very clearly state a New York subtotal. This first example of an invoice here includes 2 New York products, which you can't actually tell by looking at the invoice because only the grape juice is labeled as New York. Without additional documentation during an audit, only the juice could be counted toward your New York totals, even though the beets are also grown in New York. In order for the beets to count as a New York purchase, they would need to be labeled as New York or be accompanied by some additional documentation we will go over later in this presentation. We'll get into more detail about all of the documentation you would need for these products in a few minutes. The next invoice example is from a distributor that provides a New York subtotal on their invoices. Even though each of the New York products aren't labeled New York, it's clear that the New York subtotal is a subtotal of these purchases. State Ed has communicated that it wouldn't be necessary in this case to indicate New York next to each type of item on this type of invoice. Now we're going to move on to documentation requirement basics. I'm going to quickly go over the last three things on here. The first is separated breakfast costs. Because the initiative only takes into account purchases you made for lunch, you need to clearly show how you separate out your breakfast and lunch costs. You must have complete production records for breakfast or lunch. Milk is where most districts are frequently tripped up. You must have accurate production records. A percentage is not acceptable. Work with your staff to review your tracking procedures and ensure all milk is being tracked accurately. You also need to demonstrate your use of New York products at lunch. For this, you'll need complete production records. For a la carte items, you can use your lunch menu to show when products are served. And finally, your total New York State money requirement. This is just your revenue and expenditure report from your school's accounting system. Now, let's move on to the requirements that have been a little more fuzzy. Unprocessed produce is produce that is in its whole, raw form, so whole apples, whole potatoes, heads of lettuce, etc. As we covered earlier, your invoice must either list New York next to each item or clearly provide a subtotal of New York products. How you attest that the unprocessed products you purchase are in fact grown in New York depends on whether you purchase them directly from a farmer or if you purchase them from a distributor. If you purchase unprocessed produce directly from a farmer, the farmer should supply either a signed letter on company letterhead listing their New York farm products and their farm address, or they should provide an email or a letter that includes their name, their title, the farm name and address, and a list of their farm products. If you purchase unprocessed produce from a distributor, they should provide a list of farms from which they source produce, the address for each farm, and a list of produce they get from each farm. Processed New York products include any products that are not whole, raw fruits or vegetables, such as minimally processed produce, which we will discuss more in depth, frozen produce, meat, dairy, maple syrup and honey, and packaged products. If an item is New York grown and certified, you don't need a product formulation statement. You do need to maintain documentation that a product is New York grown and certified. Acceptable documentation includes the product's listing on the New York Grown and Certified website or a copy of their New York Grown and Certified certificate. For all other processed products, a product formulation statement is required. Because a product formulation statement is required for each processed product in a final product, more than one statement may be required. We will see examples of this later. Now for our first update or clarification. Product formulation statements are required for minimally processed produce. Minimally processed produce is any produce not in its whole raw form. It includes cut, chopped, peeled, wedged, shucked, and frozen produce, etc. Some commonly purchased minimally processed produce items include shucked or husked corn, chopped Brussels sprouts, cut or wedged potatoes, shredded cabbage or coleslaw mix, and peeled carrots. To reiterate, for any of these purchases to count toward your New York total, you must have a product formulation statement for them. So how should a product formulation statement be completed? The vast majority of the product formulation statements that were available when we began compiling this guide and the New York product database were inaccurate. Common mistakes were listing percentages instead of weights or not being filled out by the processor. We will now go through in detail what is required in a product formulation statement. Then we will review several inaccurate and accurate product formulation statements. First, a product formulation statement must be completed by the processor. It should not be completed by the farmer or by the company that markets the product, for example. The total amount of New York State ingredients and the total amount of raw product must be listed as weight or volume, not as a percent. In the statements we reviewed, listing the amount as a percentage was probably the most common error. The next one is likely the most difficult to accurately implement. The product code, product batch or run number, and production date must tie back to the invoice or packing slip, which you must keep with your documentation. Now, ensuring this paper trail exists can be burdensome, especially when you're relying on a distributor to include the required documentation or information on an invoice. We consulted with State Ed, and they agreed that if the product's manufacturer produces a New York-only version of a product, and this product is made with a consistent percentage of New York ingredients, there's no need to list a product batch or run number or a production date. If this is the case, the manufacturer should instead indicate all in the allotted spaces on the invoice. This eliminates the need to tie a batch or run number or a production date back to your invoice. However, the product code must be unique to the New York product. It cannot be associated with a non-New York version of the same product. While this may sound like a lot, we have not come across any circumstances in which a manufacturer is using the same code for a qualifying New York product and a non-New York product. We will go over specific examples of product formulation statements for which the batch run number and production date were not required when we discuss documentation for processed foods. We just covered this, but I want to reiterate two very common mistakes. By making sure you clarify these for your processor prior to asking them to fill out a product formulation statement, you can hopefully avoid a lot of back and forth. The first is that the amount of New York State ingredients, the total amount of all New York State ingredients, and the total amount raw product are often listed as a percentage. These must be listed as weight or volume. The next one we find is that the percent of New York State ingredients doesn't make sense. This is often due to the fact that the total amount of all New York State ingredients is actually greater in weight or volume than the final product, due to things like water loss with potatoes or when you're getting beef, for example. If the total amount of New York State ingredient is greater than the total amount of product, ask your processor for a letter or email clearly describing this. Okay, so when is a product formulation statement needed for produce? Let's run through some scenarios. Scenario number 1. You purchase raw potato wedges from Bippert's Farm Market, a grower and distributor. Bippert sourced the whole potatoes from Aldinger's farm and then sent them to a processor to be processed. That processor must complete a product formulation statement. And don't forget that you will also need to attest to the farm sources for your audit. Here is a mock example of a product formulation statement for this scenario. As you can see, it is completed and signed by the processor. The amount of New York State ingredient, total amount of all New York State ingredients, and total amount raw product are all listed by weight, not as a percent. In this case, the product code, batch run number, and production dates would need to track the invoice. Scenario number 2. You purchase shucked corn from Eden Valley growers. Eden Valley growers grew the corn and shucked it on site. You do not need a product formulation statement because Eden Valley growers is the grower and the processor. As long as a product is processed where it's grown, a product formulation statement isn't needed. The hitch is that you still need to indicate on the invoice that the shucked corn came from Eden Valley growers. Scenario number 3. You purchase shucked corn from Bippert's. Bippert's sourced the corn from Eden Valley growers, who grew and shucked the corn. You need a product formulation statement from Eden Valley growers because while they grew the corn and shucked it on site, you bought it from a distributor. Scenario number 4. You purchase shucked corn from Bippert's. Bippert's got the corn from the Genesee Valley produce auction and then shucked it. You need a product formulation statement from Bippert's since they are the processor. Here's an example of an accurately completed product formulation statement that fits into scenario number 4. The Hub on the Hill purchased carrots from Juniper Hill Farms and processed them into coins, so they completed and signed the product formulation statement. You can also see that weight is used accurately to show the amount and that all the numbers add up. Next, we'll discuss the documentation required for local beef purchases. To properly account for these purchases, you need to make sure your invoice, product formulation statement, and processor letter include some specific information. First, the invoice needs to tie back to the product formulation statement. A best practice would be to include the tag numbers or other tracking mechanism the processor assigned to the live animals they processed into the beef your invoice is reflecting purchase of. We'll see an example of this in a minute. Next, the product formulation statement must be completed by the processor, not the farmer. And finally, you must have a letter from the processor clearly detailing how they ensure the beef they are returning to the farmer, vendor, or distributor came from the cows provided by X farm. In this first invoice example, there is nothing that would allow you to trace the beef back to the product formulation statement, so it's unacceptable as is. The letter, which is not acceptable, is an actual letter that was provided by a farmer, which is the first error. It must be completed by the processor. This letter doesn't actually detail the processor's tagging or tracking system. It just says it exists. As such, it doesn't sufficiently demonstrate how the processor ensures the beef they return to a customer came from the cows the customer provided. Here is an acceptable invoice which includes the same tag numbers that are also on the product formulation statement. Here's a mock-up of an acceptable product formulation statement. As you can see, the product code is actually the tag numbers, and those align with our sample invoice. The ingredient is listed as whole cows, not as beef. This is because the processor receives whole live animals. Beef is what comes out at the end. Finally, you want to have some explanation of how you get from the whole cow weight to the final beef weight. The information I used for this mock example came from South Dakota Extension, and exact ratios will differ for different cows. This letter here is a mock-up that contains all of the information State Ed is requesting. It is completed by the processor on company letterhead. There is some key language in here you should make sure your processor includes in their letter. The first is whole animal. State Ed wants to know that it is an entire animal going from a farm to a processor. Individual lot. This language confirms to State Ed that the cows from one farm aren't being processed along with the cows from another farm. And just to reiterate those two previous points, a customer receives all of and only the meat from the animals they dropped off. Let's move on to processed foods. As a reminder, if a processed food is New York grown and certified, you don't need a product formulation statement. However, for your audit, you do need to provide documentation that the product is New York grown and certified. As of this recording, the New York State Department of Agriculture has not made available a list of products that are New York State grown and certified. State Ed has said they will accept a copy of the company's New York grown and certified certificate, or a link to the producer's record on the New York Grown and Certified website. They may accept a list of New York Grown and Certified products if one becomes available. For non-New York Grown and Certified products, you need a product formulation statement. Some products will require more than one product formulation statement. Let's look at an example of one of those first. Scenario number 1, Issa's Pita Chips. They are made by Cedars Bakery and Deli using flours from Wild Hive Grain Project. Because flour itself is a processed product, it requires its own product formulation statement. You will also need a product formulation statement for the actual pita chips. Here is product formulation statement 1 of 2 required for Issa's Pita Chips. This product formulation statement is for white wholemeal, and the New York State ingredient is soft white winter wheat. Because this specific product is always made with wheat from this farm, the batch run number and production date are listed as all. This statement is completed by Wild Hive Grain Project, which actually receives the wheat and processes it into wholemeal. The second product formulation statement needed for Issa's Pita Chips is for the actual pita chip. In this case, the raw New York State ingredient is the wholemeal flour. You can see here that a product or batch run number and production dates are needed because Issa's also processes a non-New York version of this chip. Cedars Bakery is the processor and as such completed the product formulation statement. Another example of a product or products that require 2 product formulation statements are the Welch's Concord Grape Juice Slush and the Welch's Concord Grape Apple Juice Cup. In this case, the final packaged product is made by King Brands on behalf of Cool Tropics. It's made using a grape juice concentrate which they purchase from Welch's. Welch's makes the grape juice concentrate out of New York Concord grapes, so working backwards, you need 1 product formulation statement from Welch's for the grape juice concentrate, in which the New York State ingredient is listed as Concord grapes. And then you need another one for the slush or juice, in which the New York State ingredient is listed as Concord grape juice concentrate. Here's what those statements look like. We have the actual product formulation statements here. For the first one, you can see that the product is the grape juice concentrate, and the processor is Welch's. Next, we have the second product formulation statement, which is for the actual juice. The processor is King Brands on behalf of Cool Tropics. This product is always made with the same amount of New York Concord grape juice concentrate from Welch's. Just a note, the documentation for the Welch's products also includes a list of the farms in the Welch's Grape Juice Cooperative on company letterhead, and a letter describing the relationship between Welch's, Cool Tropics, and King Brands. Next, we have a few examples of product formulation statements for processed products. The first is a nice, straightforward, and accurately completed one for Ithaca Soy Bulk Tofu. Ithaca Soy always makes this product with 100% New York grown soybeans, so they don't need a product code, batch run number, or production dates. The water and calcium sulfate don't actually need to be included on here, but it's fine that they are. The next example is for the New York egg roll, and it's almost accurate. The only thing off on this one is that they should have just listed all for the product or batch run number and production dates. Because these lines say as marked on each case label of this product, you would need to keep every case label. Don't worry about this product though, because she will provide you with an accurate product formulation statement. The next is for New York chips. Because the batch or run number and production date are listed, they would need to tie back to the invoice. Having to track this back is a headache you can avoid with many products, including these chips, which we will see when we review the accurately completed version of this product formulation statement in the next slide. The other thing you will notice is that the ingredient amounts are listed as percentages rather than weights or volumes. The amount must be listed as a weight or volume. And now we have the fixed version of the New York Chips product formulation statement. The product or batch run number and production date are listed as all because this product is always made with a consistent amount of New York potatoes from the same farm. The amount of New York State ingredient has been changed to the volume of this product. The same goes for the total amount of all New York State ingredients. It is listed as a volume rather than a percent. And finally, the total amount of raw product is the volume of the finished product. The last topic we will discuss is when State Ed will accept additional documentation to qualify products that wouldn't otherwise qualify per their invoice. There are two general scenarios in which this may occur. The first is when the manufacturer's product code and the distributor's product code don't match. And the second is when New York or a New York subtotal are not indicated on an invoice. The second scenario applies only to unprocessed produce. Vendors and distributors such as US Foods and Cisco often assign their own unique product codes that do not match the product codes listed by processors on product formulation statements. Without additional documentation, it's not possible to link the product formulation statement back to your invoice, since the product code on the product formulation statement is the processor's product code, and the one on your invoice is the distributor's product code. In addition to the product formulation statement and your invoice, vendors and distributors who assign their unique product code should provide a letter or statement demonstrating how they ensure the New York item on an invoice is the item on the associated product formulation statement, and also the item received by the school. New York State Department of Education suggests including the following information in this letter. The New York food product information, such as name, pack size, and manufacturer. This must match the product formulation statement. Production date and batch run numbers, unless these are listed as all on the product formulation statement. The processor's assigned product code as indicated on the product formulation statement. The distributor or vendor's unique product code, and a written process of how they ensure the New York food product is being received by the schools. The second scenario in which State Ed will accept additional documentation to attest to a New York product's origin is when items on an invoice are not indicated as being New York or there's not a New York subtotal. This only applies to unprocessed produce purchases. When the invoice for an unprocessed product does not indicate that the product is New York or does not include a New York subtotal, State Ed will accept a letter, statement, or other documentation indicating the product's farm origin, name, and address. This product documentation also needs to demonstrate that the product was grown on the farm indicated. Just a note, both of these scenarios also apply to New York grown and certified products. Because of the significant differences in distributor invoices and internal operating systems, there is no one-size-fits-all solution when the distributor and processor code do not match, or when New York or a New York subtotal are not indicated on an invoice. As such, State Ed will consider documentation on a case-by-case basis. School food authorities should assess a distributor's unique system or process to determine whether or not it reasonably connects back to their invoices, and what information needs to be reflected in a letter if it does not. That concludes our presentation. Just a few reminders before. While New York State Department of Education was consulted in the development of the 30% documentation guide, which provided the content for this presentation, school food authorities are responsible for ensuring their tracking process and documentation are accurate and sufficient. Formal guidance and presentations related to procurement, tracking, and the application process can be found on the Child Nutrition website. And finally, we do have a number of resources on the Harvest New York website, which we would encourage you to explore. Resources related to this presentation that can be found by navigating to the website's Local Foods tab include a statewide list of farm-to-school support providers, including farm-to-school coordinators, a PDF version of this presentation, the 30% New York documentation guide, and, coming soon, a link to the New York product database. There was a great deal of content presented in this presentation, and we encourage you to work with a farm-to-school support provider to help ensure you have the documentation you will need to pass your 30% audit. If you have any questions about the content presented, please contact myself or Cheryl Thayer. Thank you for listening.